Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you to FIU and all the sponsors here, the Institute and others, the opportunity to be here. Is there a way to see the time, or can you, when I get to 2 minutes, let me know, and I'll do it. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we framed this particular project and where it comes from and how we came to this. I recently wrote another publication for Florida International University, which I called The Fourth Wave of Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America. And basically my thesis in that paper was that we're undergoing a transformative moment in transnational crime in Latin America that unlike we've ever seen before. We're at an entirely new world in terms of transnational organized crime actors, etc. Essentially, I defined the first wave as Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel and their ability to create massive amounts of cocaine, move it to the United States, and bring the money back to Colombia. And the assault on the state of Colombia as an act of war against the Colombian state. Pablo Escobar gets killed. With Pacho, I lived through those moments together in Colombia for many years, President Pastrana. And after that moment passes, you have what we define the second wave is the Cali cartel. They are much more innovative. They move the trafficking routes from the Caribbean to Mexico, which gives birth to the Mexican cartels you see today. And they're much more sophisticated, but you still have essentially one product, which is cocaine, going to one market, which is the United States, and the money coming back to the countries of origin. The third wave we defined as the Bolivarian Revolution, where for the first time you have states, Venezuela, at the time Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, embracing a criminal or structure as an instrument of state policy, which was at that moment the FARC. There was the ability and the courting of FARC, the use of their money, their incorporating of the FARC into their government structure as instruments of state policy, as opposed to what we had seen before, which was corruption, right? You wanted to buy a judge so you could go free. You wanted to buy an aduana agent so you could get your drug across the border. You wanted to buy a policeman to turn a blind eye. This, for the first time with the Bolivarians, you saw the incorporation of a criminal group into the financial flows and the protection both of the Venezuelan state, because they're operating on the Colombia border with Venezuela, and into taking policy decisions on their behalf and bringing in weapons for them. But again, still we had essentially the same model. You had one product primarily. It grew into two with the expansion into illicit gold, of cocaine going to one market basically, which was the United States. Gold started to flow in significant ways after a decade of the Bolivarians. You have the defeat of Rafael Correa in Bolivia, and Ecuador. You have the defeat eventually of Evo Morales in Bolivia. Daniel Ortega remains firmly ensconced, as does the Maduro regime. So what's different about the fourth wave that leads us to this study? This is for the first time we have seen a whole host of new products, which is why territories that we discussed in this study on the subregions of Argentina that are still feudal are so important. You have a massive increase in illicit markets, and you have a massive increase in actors in the region. So for the first time in Latin America, we have established on the ground functioning entities, the 'Ndrangheta, the Italian mafia, we have the Albanian mafias, we have the Turkish mafias, we have the Russian mafias, we have the Chinese mafias, we have a whole series of new actors, and part of this is due to, and again, it's one of the driving factors which I'll talk about on the sub-state level in Argentina. You have an enormous change in the global drug market. The United States consumption of cocaine is stable or dropping, and the prices are relatively stable. We are no longer the most attractive market for cocaine in the world. We're very attractive for synthetics and other things, but not for cocaine. Where have prices skyrocketed? Europe, the former Soviet Republic, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So if you can sell a kilo for $17,000 in Miami, maybe $20,000 in New York, or $35,000 in Spain, where are you going to start looking for? Because we're talking about rational economic actors, and when we talk about transnational organized crime, they're primarily motivated by rational economic decisions. So how does this impact what we're seeing now? Ports become tremendously important in ways that they weren't before, because you can't fly a ton of cocaine to Europe. You can't put it on a human mula and send it across the border. You have to begin using containers to move things across large spaces and times to markets that are very available. At the same time, as we've seen, and President Mawat clearly knows, in Ecuador, we had an unusual phenomenon which gave rise to what we're seeing today, which was President Correa's decision to declare universal citizenship, ciudadanía universal, which essentially allowed anyone to move into Ecuador without any background checks in any way. And then that's where you see the beginnings of the incursions of the Albanian mafias and the other mafias. They came in starting in 2010, set up. Many of them changed their identities from their original Balkan identity to another Balkan identity, then eventually to Ecuadorian identity. So now we have no idea who these people really are because their real identities have been lost in the midst of time. But when you see Ecuador explode into this level of violence with the Albanians, it's not something that came out of nowhere. It's something that had been there, gestating for many years, and then the conditions were correct. So we have this explosion of violence. So as we were looking at all of that, we were looking at other factors too, because you have these, that's on the national state level where you're seeing, you can identify these trends. And then we're seeing places, as we did the study in Argentina with the support of the Institute and FIU and others, to identify the sub-state actors that are making all of this possible too, because you have across the region existing systems of caudillismo, where you still have, in many cases, the remnants of the old regimes of strongmen who have lasted for decades. So in the case of Santiago del Estero, you have a governor and his wife who have been there since 2004 and have not given up power since. They alternate between being, one is the senator, a senator, usually the wife, and the governor stays, and they rotate amongst themselves. But 20 years in power without any change. Other provinces that are basically the same. And it really took root under the government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the Kirchner couple, when they took power, where they began to use these isolated feudal states, which eventually, as we were able to document and spend a lot of time on the ground in Santiago del Estero and elsewhere in Argentina, where the governor has his own police force, his own intelligence service, control of the courts, he has control of the internet, he has control of all the media. And so you have, in a relatively democratic nation like Argentina, these enclaves of departmental power where the feudal structure still exists. And those are important because, for example, Santiago del Estero is right in the middle of the lithium. It doesn't have lithium itself, but it's right in the middle of the lithium belt. It's also on the key highway transit of cocaine that goes from Bolivia, to the coast, because now you need the ports. You need to get to Montevideo, you need to get to Buenos Aires to move your product to market. At the same time, you have this ongoing parallel phenomenon of internal consumption in Latin America of cocaine. So for years, people would always say, and they were generally right, it's a U.S. problem. Right? The consumption is there. We produce it. It's a U.S. problem. That's no longer the case. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay are among the top 10 per capita consumers of cocaine now in the world. And so you have this dynamic also moving the cocaine markets. So in this general framework, these feudal provincial governments that operate completely autonomously from the state, and that's not true. They don't operate completely autonomously. They take decisions autonomously from the state, and in exchange for massive central government subsidies, they give the votes, they make sure that their voters vote for the government in power. Primarily in this case, the Cristina, La Cámpora, the groups around the Kirchners, because it solidified their power in the central government in exchange for complete autonomy in the regional states. So as we were looking at these groups, we found commonalities that define, I would say, authoritarian states at the national level are all part of implemented at the subnational level in ways that have created enormous disaster zones inside these countries. Because, for example, Santiago del Estero and the other states, provinces we looked at are among the poorest in Argentina. They get the most subsidy per capita from the federal government, and it's all essentially siphoned off by the local government. So the people get nothing. They have the highest rates of extreme poverty, the highest rates of illiteracy, the highest rates of being without basic domestic services like sewage, et cetera, while on the surface while the money is flowing in, it's not getting anywhere near them. And so you have these extraordinary circumstances, and I keep talking about Santiago del Estero because it was the most dramatic, where you have a governor who built a world-class soccer stadium, literally like Macarena in Brazil, and there's almost no soccer matches there. It was a pure giant money laundering effort. It's a beautiful stadium. Big statue, gold-plated Maradona in front of it, now sort of fading because they haven't kept it up. But it's just, you have to see it to actually understand the magnitude of what you're seeing. They have a whole series of other projects where they talk about how they've done like electric trains. But if you ride their trams, they're all diesel generated. There's nothing electric about them. They put in an international airport that gets 2 international flights a month. Okay, that's interesting. And they have all of the trappings of this. But so you essentially have mechanisms at the local level that allow massive laundering and the protection of the drug flows that are now flowing primarily from Bolivia, Peru, south to Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and other, now we're seeing it leak into Chile and onto the Pacific coast and doing other things. But these groups become incredibly important, these states, because the national state has very little say there. And I'll finish by saying one of the remarkable things that Argentinians know, but I didn't know when we started looking at this, is that the provincial government controls the land and everything under the land. So if you are a lithium company, as we saw with the Chinese in multiple states in Argentina, that province can negotiate directly with the Chinese. It doesn't pass through the central government at all. So you have, for example, as we were looking at the anomalies, because one of the things I learned working as a journalist and then with the U.S. government is that if you want to understand how money moves, look for the anomalies. What does not make rational economic sense? And that's where you're going to begin to discover this. So supposedly in Santiago del Estero, they're building one of the largest lithium factories in the world, which means you have to extract the lithium. They have no direct route to the sea. The train hasn't run in like the last 20 years. It takes 48 hours by truck to get there. Then you have to send it to be refined in China. Then it has to come back, and you have to put it back up in Santiago del Estero and start building batteries. Not an economically rational model. So what does that tell you about what's actually going on there? You probably have a giant bunch of people, the governor paid off by an enormous amounts of money to create the semblance to let the Chinese do whatever they want to do. And in the lithium provinces surrounding Santiago del Estero, what we found consistently was that the Chinese companies, primarily Chinese, some Canadian companies, but the Chinese were much more aggressive, would come in and say, okay, we need this piece of land for lithium. And if there is an indigenous population, they would say to the police, can you remove them? And they say, sure. Boom, off you go. No reports of human rights abuse. Well, the Institute has documented human rights abuses and other things, but largely in the international community, that's all, because it's far away, nobody really pays attention to it, it's hard to get to, etc. That whole structure remains with an enormous amount of impunity. So what we were trying to document in this particular in the study was the importance of not just looking at the national structures, because those we can identify and they're on our radar at least. If we're not very effective in combating them, we at least know where they are. The subnational ones, and we did Argentina, but the same type of structure exists in Brazil, exists to a degree in northern Chile. Peru has these type of islands. Every country has these very, very isolated and very powerful caudillos that still exist and bring about an enormous amount of resources to the central government, foment corruption, and are huge supports in the substructure of transnational organized crime. So I will leave it there. I don't know what the next forum is, but I will leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.